Can Ken Kesey's writing advice help you improve your writing? Even if it's hard to say. We're going to find out today. I've got some of his thoughts and quotes about writing to talk about, so let's get into it. Number 1, plot comes out of character, not the other way around. The trick is for us to build character in our characters, to breathe life into them, to get them to stand up, stretch, and start doing stuff. We're not interested in pulling strings and being puppeteers. We want these people to rise up off the page. Then we sit back and follow them through the novel. The opening of this tip, so plot comes out of character, not the other way around, I think is really great advice. On this channel, I often say, probably too much, stories are about people, because they are, but the word people here is key, I think. If you can give your characters enough detail and individuality to make them feel like people, their natural preferences and characteristics will influence their decisions, and a big part of plot is people making choices. I want to comment on that last bit he said too, about sitting back and following your characters through the novel. If you know anything about him, Kesey was considered more or less a part of the Beat generation of writers who were in some sense experimental when compared with traditional literary approaches or conventions of the time. So if we think about something like Jack Kerouac's On the Road, for example, there's no defined plot or no sequence of interconnected events. It really does what Kesey suggests here, which is just follow the characters and see what happens. However, the point I want to make here is that, to me at least, Kesey doesn't just mean that kind of structureless novel with this tip. Even if you're plotting a novel entirely from start to finish before you even make a single mark on the page, you should still let your characters guide you. If you can, try and listen to them and see what decisions they would make. Not necessarily what decision is right or the same decision as you, but what kind of choice they would really choose. I think that'll create a more solid logic to your story with the added benefit of more realistic characters. By the way, if you're new here, my name's Kieren. I'm a writer and a freelance editor, and I love helping writers tell their stories and have fun doing it. Number 2, what keeps people from being successful is not the inability to write, it's the inability to sink your teeth into something and say, it's me and you going down together. I like this tip, but I'm not sure I'm necessarily interpreting it right. To me, he's talking about perseverance here, not just in the craft of writing as a whole, but on a project-by-project level. It's about the importance of finishing stories. That's a really good lesson for any writer to learn, I think, but especially a new writer. When I was new to the craft, and don't get me wrong, I'll always still be learning to write. I just used to know a bit less than I know now, I suppose. But anyway, back then I would get about halfway through something, realise it maybe wasn't the best, and then abandon it for something I thought was better. At the time, that made total sense to me. Why waste time struggling to finish a story that you no longer had faith in? The thing is though, there is value in that. Pushing through and finishing that story might lead you to discover that there actually was value there. You just maybe hadn't got to it yet. Or even if you're completely right and the story isn't your best work, there's definitely still value in practicing writing another awkward middle or another difficult ending. There's value in struggling out of a corner that you might have written yourself into, because you'll be making yourself stronger as a writer, even if that project still doesn't end up working out. Bear with me, because there's about 4 people that'll get this reference, but it reminds me of that scene in Lost, if you watched it a million years ago when it broadcast, where John Locke is watching this butterfly try to break out of its chrysalis, and he says that he could help it and just cut a tiny opening with his knife, but if he did that, the butterfly then wouldn't have built up enough strength to survive. A somewhat dramatic and obscure comparison to draw, I know, but the concept is kind of the same. We have to struggle sometimes in order to develop the skills we need for more complex stories. But like I said at the beginning, I'm not entirely sure that's what Kesey meant with that tip or that quote, but that's what I took from it. Sorry, I'm interrupting my own video to tell you about my editing service. Whether you're working on short fiction or a full novel, I'd love to help you get the most out of it. I'll look at all the usual stuff like your spelling and grammar, but I'll also focus on how the story works, your dialogue, plot, pace and structure, everything basically. I'll annotate your work with notes in the margin, and then at the end I'll write up all my thoughts, including your strengths, areas to develop, and what I recommend you focus on. It's all done over email unless you want to hop on a video call to talk about something, so it can fit into any schedule, and all my feedback is friendly, positive, and most importantly, actionable. There's no need to take my word for all this though. There's tons of testimonials on my website from writers I've worked with if you want to know what they thought directly. Links in the description or scan the QR code on the screen. Thanks for your patience. Back to the video. Number 3, one of the dumbest things you were ever taught was to write what you know, because what you know is usually dull. Remember when you first wanted to be a writer, 8 or 10 years old, reading about thin-lipped heroes flying over mysterious, viney jungles towards untold wonders? That's what you wanted to write about what you didn't know, so what mysterious time and place don't we know? I feel like I've addressed write what you know a good few times over this series of author advice videos, but I'll quickly give some thoughts anyway. What he's saying here is absolutely right, I think. I know for a fact that if I only wrote about stuff that I'd had direct experience of in my life, then my stories would not be anywhere near as interesting as they are now, if they even are now. And obviously, if we took write what you know quite literally, there would be no fantasy or sci-fi and so on, but obviously it's not intended to mean that. I think what it means and how it can be helpful is if we frame it as keep things as real as you can. Make sure the concepts and situations and emotions of your characters are things your readers can actually understand and empathise with. Like I said before, stories are about people. I think write what you know links into that really strongly. Create your worlds, bring them to life, make them expansive and dramatic if you want. Just keep the heart of them in a place that readers will know. Number 4. Good writing ain't necessarily good reading. Very short and accurate, I think. There are age-old warnings out there about writing purple prose and filling your writing with elaborate literary flourishes. We know all about those, we've seen them. We know that generally it's better to be a bit more concise and straightforward in most scenarios. But beyond that, I think this is something that you really need to think about when you're editing your finished story. This might just be something that I suffer with, but my mindset and my impression of my writing as I'm writing it compared with afterwards doesn't always align. There's usually something I can find that I've written that I thought worked really well, and in the light of the next day, it doesn't quite appear the same. They're always the same kind of thing, stuff that made me think in the moment, oh, that's quite good, but when I look at it again, I immediately see a simpler and more effective way to say whatever I said. This one, I think, really depends on what you want from your writing. I'm sure we'd all love to be regarded as good writers. We'd all like to be recognised like that in some way. But personally, I would prefer for my entire story to land reasonably well than for someone to pick out one really good line that I've written. Other writers, though, would put more emphasis on their characteristic style and approach and worry less about the other stuff. And I don't necessarily disagree with that. But for me, it's all about clarity. Good reading is always the priority. Good writing is a bonus. Number 5, there's no in-between with a novel. You either finish it and you get it published, or it doesn't get accepted and you've failed. So I'm always quite conscious, if you've seen any of these videos before, that I usually agree with the writer or I have my own take on whatever they've said. This time though, I can't say the same thing. I really disagree that a novel is a failure if it isn't accepted for publication. If that were the case, so many far fewer novels would ever be written, and I think that would be a real shame. The literary landscape is different now, of course. When Kesey was writing, it wasn't as acceptable or as accessible to self-publish your work, especially not with the kind of reach that's possible today. But still, considering only published novels as successful really is a departure from the idea that writing is art, which to me it absolutely is. And personally, if I can still stand to read the thing after a couple of rounds of edits, I consider a book successful. As I said before, yes, finishing stories is hugely important. Half a novel never gets you anywhere, commercially or otherwise. Finish your stories. But what comes after that is this whole other thing. And you don't have to wait for anyone's approval of your art to be happy with it yourself and to consider it successful on your terms. It never hurts when people appreciate and support your work though, of course. In fact, there's a quote I found from Ken Kesey all about that. It's important to support everyone who tries to write because their victories are your victories. So I've never really felt that bitter cattiness writers feel towards their peers. I love that. That's my philosophy too. Beginners or experts, everyone should be encouraged and supported. That's what I try and do with these videos and this channel in general. With that in mind, there's a playlist on the screen of all of my famous author advice videos, so have a quick look and see if your favourite author's listed. If they're not, let me know in the comments. As always, thank you so much for watching and happy writing.